The floor beneath my boots was made of black stone that glowed faintly with veins of blue light, and every single person around me was already on their knees before I even understood what was happening. I am Ethan Vance, a soldier of Earth, and I was standing in a hall built for giants, surrounded by creatures from 100 different worlds, all of them bowing their heads to a woman who had not yet said a single word. We had been brought here in chains of light, not metal, bands that wrapped around our wrists and pulsed with a soft warning hum whenever we tried to pull away. Our small human delegation, 7 of us in total, had been marched through corridors taller than any cathedral back home, past statues of alien generals and murals of conquests that stretched back further than written human history. Claire Bennett, our lead ambassador, walked just ahead of me, her spine straight, her jaw tight. Beside her was Oliver Grant, our youngest officer, barely 25, his eyes wide with a fear he was trying hard to hide. I did not blame him. I felt that fear too, coiled tight in my chest, like a spring ready to snap. But fear and obedience are not the same thing, and I had learned that lesson a long time before I ever set foot on an alien world. The hall fell silent as the throne room doors opened, and I saw her for the first time. Queen Ysandra of the Drenmore Dominion did not walk so much as glide, her long robes trailing behind her like liquid starlight, her skin a pale shade of violet that seemed to shift colors depending on how the light struck it. She was tall, taller than any human I had ever seen, and her eyes held no pupils at all, only a soft glowing white that made it impossible to know exactly where she was looking. The moment she stepped past the threshold, every creature in that hall dropped to one knee. Not out of instinct, I realized, but out of pure conditioning. Generations of it. Entire species bent low the second her shadow touched the floor. I watched aliens with 4 arms, and aliens with insectoid faces, and aliens that looked almost human, except for the metallic plating along their spines. All of them folding down at once, like a wave rolling across the sea. Claire knelt. Oliver knelt. One by one, my entire delegation lowered themselves to the cold stone floor, because we had been warned, over and over, before we ever left Earth, that first contact protocol meant survival through compliance. Do not provoke, do not resist. Observe, adapt, and above all, do not give them a reason to end the conversation before it even begins. I understood the strategy, I understood why it mattered, and yet my knees did not bend. I stood there, alone, among a sea of bowed heads, my chains humming softly around my wrists, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I was certain everyone in the room could hear it. I was not being brave in that moment. I want to be honest about that. I was terrified. But something in me, something older than strategy and older than fear, simply refused to let my body fold. My father used to tell me that a soldier's spine is not just bone, it is a promise that no matter what stands in front of you, you decide for yourself whether you bend or not. He fought in wars I will not describe here, wars that took pieces of him he never fully got back, and the one thing he always said, every single time, was that the day you kneel out of fear is the day you have already surrendered something you can never take back. I heard Claire's sharp breath beside me. She did not dare look up, but I felt her tension radiating off her like heat from a fire. "Ethan," she whispered, so quiet I almost missed it. "Kneel, please." I heard her. I understood the risk, but my legs simply would not obey. The Queen's gliding steps slowed, then stopped. A silence fell over that enormous hall, the kind of silence that presses against your eardrums, thick and suffocating. I could hear the faint hum of the energy chains around my wrists, the shallow breathing of the delegation beside me, and somewhere far above, the soft mechanical whir of some unseen device tracking the room. The Queen turned. Her glowing eyes settled directly on me, and for the first time since we had arrived on this world, I felt the full weight of her attention, like a physical pressure pushing against my chest. Every alien advisor near the throne turned their heads as well. Dozens of unfamiliar faces, some curious, some horrified, some almost amused, all fixed on the one figure in the entire hall, who remained standing. I did not move. I did not speak. I simply stood there, meeting eyes that had no pupils, no clear direction, and yet somehow I knew she was looking straight through me. The silence stretched long enough that I began counting my own heartbeats just to keep from losing my nerve. 1, 2, 3, 4. Then her voice broke the stillness, and it was not what I expected. It was calm, measured, almost gentle, in a way that made it more unsettling than if she had screamed. "Interesting," she said, the single word rolling through the hall and bouncing softly off the high stone ceilings. She took a step toward me, then another, her robes whispering against the glowing floor. The guards flanking the throne shifted, their weapons humming to life, ready for a command that had not yet come. I could feel Claire's fear beside me like a living thing, and I understood that whatever happened in the next few seconds could decide the fate of everyone I had brought with me to this world, maybe even the fate of Earth itself. But still, I did not kneel. The Queen stopped only a few feet away from me now, close enough that I could see the faint patterns moving beneath her skin, like slow ripples across still water. She tilted her head, studying me the way someone might study an insect that had wandered somewhere it should not exist. "Do you understand where you are, human?" she asked, her voice carrying easily across the silent hall. "I understand exactly where I am," I said, and I was surprised by how steady my own voice sounded, considering how hard my hands were shaking at my sides. "Then you understand that every creature in this hall who has ever stood before me has learned the value of humility," she continued. "Species older than your entire recorded history have bent their knees in this very room. Empires that once believed themselves untouchable have folded before me without hesitation." "I do not doubt that," I said. "Then why," she asked, her voice sharpening just slightly, "do you remain standing?" I felt every eye in the room burning into me. I felt Claire's silent, desperate plea beside me, urging me to simply lower myself, to end this before it became something none of us could walk back from. But I thought of my father's voice, of every soldier I had lost during the brief and brutal skirmishes that had marked humanity's first true encounter with a spacefaring civilization, of every name etched onto a memorial wall back home that I had sworn to honor. "Because kneeling, for my people, means something very specific," I said. "We kneel for love. We kneel out of respect that is earned, not demanded. We kneel beside graves to honor those we have lost. But we do not kneel out of fear, and we do not kneel simply because someone tells us that we must." A murmur rippled through the hall, alien voices whispering in dozens of languages I could not understand, some clearly scandalized, others intrigued. I saw one of the Queen's advisors, a tall creature with segmented armor plating along his arms, lean forward with narrowed eyes, watching me the way a predator watches something unfamiliar that has wandered too close. The Queen's expression, if it could even be called an expression, shifted into something unreadable. She studied me for a long moment, her glowing eyes unblinking, before she finally spoke again. "How dare you, human?" she said, her voice suddenly sharper, cutting through the silence like a blade. The words hung in the air, and I felt the entire hall hold its breath along with me. I did not know, in that moment, whether those words would be followed by an execution or a question. I only knew that I had already made my choice, and there was no version of this moment where I would take it back. "I do not dare anything, Your Majesty," I said carefully. "I simply stand as I was raised to stand." Her eyes narrowed slightly, and for a moment I thought I saw something flicker behind that glowing white, something that almost resembled curiosity fighting against outrage. "Do you understand what happens to those who defy me in my own hall?" she asked. "I understand that I am the only one standing," I said, "and I understand that you have not yet given the order to make me kneel by force, which tells me that some part of you wants to understand why, before you decide what to do with me." The silence that followed felt like it lasted an eternity. Claire's breathing beside me had gone completely still. Oliver, still kneeling, had gone pale as the stone floor beneath him. Every alien advisor near the throne seemed frozen, waiting for their queen's next move, because clearly, None of them had ever witnessed anything quite like this before. Queen Yasandra studied me a moment longer, then turned slightly toward her advisors, though her eyes never fully left mine. "In all my years upon this throne," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the hall, "I have never once had a creature look me directly in the eyes and refuse to bow, without immediately following it with a plea for mercy." "I am not asking for mercy," I said quietly. "I am only asking to be understood." Her eyes lingered on me a moment longer, unreadable, calculating, before she finally turned fully back to her throne, her robes sweeping across the glowing floor with a soft whisper of sound. "Then you shall have your chance to be understood, human," she said, without turning back to face me. "Whether you survive that understanding is another matter entirely." She ascended the final few steps to her throne and settled onto it with the same fluid grace she carried in every movement, and as she sat, I finally allowed myself to breathe, my chest rising and falling in short, shallow gasps that I had been holding back without even realizing it. Claire looked up at me then, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and something else, something that almost looked like disbelief, as though she could not decide whether I had just saved us or doomed us entirely. I did not have an answer for her. I only knew that whatever came next, I would face it standing, exactly the way I had faced everything else since the day I first put on this uniform. The Queen's voice rang out once more across the hall, calm and final, the kind of calm that made every hair on the back of my neck stand on end. "Bring forth the ancient law," she said. "This human will earn the right to stand, or he will learn precisely why every other creature in this hall has chosen to kneel." And somewhere deep within that glowing throne room, I heard the distant sound of massive doors grinding open, far below us, as though something enormous had just been woken from a very long sleep. The doors below the throne room ground open with a sound like distant thunder, and I felt the vibration travel up through the stone floor and into the soles of my boots. Claire rose slowly to her feet beside me, along with the rest of our delegation, though none of them dared to speak. Oliver kept glancing at me sideways, his expression somewhere between admiration and pure terror, as though he could not decide whether I had just made us heroes or corpses. An advisor stepped forward from the side of the throne, a tall, thin creature with silver markings etched across his face, his voice carrying easily through the enormous hall. "The ancient law of challenge has been invoked," he announced. "When a creature refuses the customary submission before the throne, and the Queen chooses not to end them immediately, that creature may instead prove their worth through trial. This has not happened in over 300 cycles." I felt my stomach tighten at the word trial, though I kept my face as still as I could manage. Claire turned to me, her voice low and urgent. "What have you done?" she whispered. "I do not know yet," I admitted quietly. "But whatever it is already done." The Queen rose from her throne once more, and the entire hall fell silent again, waiting on her every word. She looked down at me from the raised platform, her glowing eyes steady and unreadable. "You claim your people kneel only for love and never for fear," she said, her voice calm but carrying an edge that had not been there before. "Then let us discover whether your people also possess the strength to back such claims. You will face my champion in the arena beneath this palace. If you survive, I will grant you the audience you seek, and I will consider your words carefully. If you fail, your delegation will submit to the customary terms given to every other conquered world, without exception." A ripple of whispers spread through the assembled aliens, some sounding excited, others sounding almost sympathetic, as though they already knew exactly what waited for me below. Claire stepped forward despite the obvious risk, her voice trembling but firm. "Your Majesty," she said, "he is a soldier, not a warrior bred for your arena. This is not a fair trial." The Queen's gaze shifted to Claire, cool and measured. "Life is rarely fair, Ambassador," she said, "yet fairness was never promised to any species that has stood in this hall before yours. Your soldier chose to stand when every wisdom of survival told him to kneel. He will now discover exactly what that choice costs." I placed a hand gently on Claire's arm, and she looked at me, her eyes searching mine for some kind of reassurance I was not entirely sure I could give her. "It is all right," I said quietly. "This is what I trained for." I did not fully believe my own words, but I said them anyway, because someone in that room needed to believe we still had a chance, and it could not be her, not in that moment. Guards approached and unlocked my energy restraints, replacing them with a simple metal collar around my neck that pulsed faintly, some kind of tracking device, I assumed, or perhaps something meant to keep me from attempting an escape. I did not resist as they led me toward a side passage, down a long spiraling staircase carved from the same glowing black stone as the throne room above. The air grew warmer as we descended, and the sound of distant crowds grew louder with every step, a low rumble of alien voices, chanting and murmuring in anticipation. By the time we reached the bottom of the staircase, the sound had become a roar, and I stepped out into an arena unlike anything I had ever imagined. It was enormous, a massive circular pit carved deep into the earth, surrounded by rising tiers of stone seating that stretched up toward an open ceiling far above, where the sky had turned a deep shade of orange as some distant sun began to set. Thousands of alien spectators filled those seats, creatures of every shape and size, all of them watching the empty sand below with restless anticipation. A guard nudged me forward, and I stepped onto the arena floor, the warm sand shifting beneath my boots. I looked up and saw the Queen seated in a private balcony high above, flanked by her advisors, watching with the same calm, unreadable expression she had worn since the moment she first noticed me refusing to kneel. A horn sounded somewhere above, deep and resonant, and the crowd's noise surged into a deafening roar. Across the arena, a massive set of gates began to grind open, and I felt my heartbeat quicken as something enormous stepped out from the darkness beyond. The Queen's champion was easily 8 feet tall, its body covered in thick gray plating that looked more like natural armor than skin, its arms ending in wide, clawed hands that could likely crush stone without much effort. Its face was narrow and reptilian, with 2 rows of small, sharp teeth and eyes that glowed the same faint orange as the setting sun above us. It moved with a slow, deliberate grace, the kind of confidence that came from a creature who had never once faced defeat. The crowd's chanting grew louder as the champion stepped fully into the arena, some alien word repeated over and over, and though I could not understand the language, I understood the meaning well enough from the tone alone. They were chanting his name, and it was not a name meant to inspire hope in me. I stood alone on the sand, unarmed except for a simple blade that had been placed at my feet by one of the guards before they retreated to the edges of the arena. I picked it up slowly, testing its weight in my hand, and found it surprisingly balanced, clearly designed for combat rather than ceremony. The champion stopped roughly 30 feet away from me, tilting his narrow head slightly, studying me the same way a hunter studies prey that has wandered somewhere it should not exist. I forced myself to breathe slowly, to steady my racing heart, and I thought back to every scrap of training I had ever received, every lesson learned in the chaos of actual combat rather than the clean simplicity of a training yard. My father's voice echoed in my mind again, calm and steady, despite the roar of the crowd around me. "Strength alone does not win fights, son," he used to say. "Strategy does. The strongest man in the room is beatable if you understand exactly where his strength ends." I studied the champion's movements as he began to circle me slowly, his massive frame surprisingly light on his feet despite his size. I noticed the way his weight shifted more heavily onto his back leg whenever he prepared to lunge, a small tell that most opponents probably never noticed before it was already too late. The horn sounded again, sharp and final, and the crowd's roar surged into a wall of noise that seemed to shake the very air around us. The champion moved first, faster than I expected for something so large, closing the distance between us in only 2 long strides, his clawed hand swinging toward me in a wide arc. I dropped low and rolled to the side, feeling the wind of the strike pass just above my head, and came up in a crouch several feet away, my heart hammering wildly against my ribs. The crowd's roar shifted into something almost disappointed as though they had expected the fight to end far sooner than this. The champion turned toward me again, faster this time, clearly recalibrating his approach after realizing I was not simply going to stand still and accept whatever came next. He lunged again, and again I moved, using the open space of the arena to keep him constantly adjusting, constantly recalculating, refusing to give him a single predictable moment to exploit. Minutes passed like this, a careful dance of strikes and evasions, my lungs burning with the effort of staying alive against something so much larger and stronger than I was. I knew I could not win through strength alone, and I knew that every second I survived was a second closer to finding the opening my father had always promised existed, if only I looked closely enough. Then I saw it. Every time the champion lunged with his right arm, his weight shifted just slightly too far forward, an instant of vulnerability that lasted barely a fraction of a second, but it was there, consistent, repeatable. I let him come at me one more time, forcing myself to stay perfectly still until the very last possible moment, every instinct in my body screaming at me to move sooner. When his claws were mere inches from my chest, I finally sidestepped, and instead of simply evading, I drove my blade upward into the exposed gap along his forearm where his natural armor plating was thinnest. The champion roared, a deep guttural sound that shook the sand beneath my feet, and stumbled back, clutching his arm. The crowd fell into a stunned silence for the first time since the fight had begun. I did not allow myself a moment to celebrate. I knew better than that. A wounded opponent was still a dangerous opponent, and I had learned long ago that overconfidence killed more soldiers than any enemy ever did. The champion turned back toward me, his glowing eyes now burning with something closer to fury than confidence, and he charged again, faster and more reckless than before. I braced myself, remembering everything my father had ever taught me about using an opponent's own momentum against them, and as he closed the final distance between us, I dropped low, driving my shoulder into his exposed midsection while sweeping my blade in a low arc across the back of his knee. He collapsed to the sand with a heavy, thunderous crash, and the entire arena fell into stunned silence. I stood over him, chest heaving, my blade still in hand, and for a long, tense moment, neither of us moved. I could have ended it there. Every instinct told me the moment was right, that this was exactly what the crowd expected, exactly what centuries of tradition demanded. Instead, I lowered my blade and stepped back. "I am not here to take a life for the sake of pride," I said, my voice carrying across the silent arena, despite how ragged my breathing had become. "I only came here to prove that my people do not kneel out of fear." The champion stared up at me from the sand, his glowing eyes wide with something I could not quite name, disbelief perhaps, or something closer to respect. Slowly, painfully, he lowered his massive head toward the ground, an unmistakable gesture of concession. The crowd remained silent for several long seconds, and then, from somewhere high above in her private balcony, I heard the queen rise slowly to her feet, her glowing eyes fixed directly on me with an expression I finally recognized. It was not anger, it was fascination. Guards rushed onto the sand to help the fallen champion to his feet, and I stood there alone, still catching my breath, my blade lowered at my side, as thousands of alien eyes stared down at me in a silence that felt heavier than the roaring crowd had only moments before. Claire and Oliver were escorted down to the edge of the arena, and the moment the guards allowed it, Claire rushed forward, gripping my arm as though she needed to confirm I was truly still standing. "You are insane," she whispered, though there was no real anger in her voice, only stunned relief. "Maybe," I said quietly, still trying to steady my breathing. "But we are still here." Above us, the queen descended from her private balcony through a hidden passage, and by the time she reappeared, she was standing at the edge of the arena itself, her advisors trailing behind her, all of them watching me, with expressions ranging from confusion to open curiosity. She approached slowly, her glowing eyes studying me from head to toe, taking in the sweat, the exhaustion, the small cut along my forearm where the champion's claws had grazed me during the fight. You had him defeated, she said, her voice carrying easily despite how quiet it was. Yet you chose not to end his life. Explain this to me. I sheathed my blade slowly, buying myself a moment to gather my thoughts before I answered her. Where I come from, Your Majesty, taking a life that does not need to be taken is not seen as strength, I said. It is seen as weakness disguised as strength. My people believe true strength is knowing when restraint matters more than victory. The Queen tilted her head slightly, the same gesture she had made back in the throne room when she first noticed me refusing to kneel. Every species I have ever encountered believes that total victory is the only outcome worth pursuing, she said. Your species appears to measure victory differently. We measure many things differently, I said carefully. That does not make us weaker, it simply makes us different. She studied me a moment longer, and then, to the shock of everyone gathered around the arena, including her own advisors, she extended a hand toward me, palm open, an unmistakable gesture, across dozens of cultures I had studied before this mission ever began. You have earned your audience, human, she said. Walk with me. I glanced at Claire, who gave me a small, uncertain nod, and I stepped forward, taking the Queen's offered hand briefly before releasing it, following her as she turned and led me away from the arena floor, through a private passage that spiraled upward toward the palace above. We walked in silence for several minutes, her advisors trailing a respectful distance behind us, until we emerged onto a wide balcony overlooking the city beyond the palace walls. The sky had fully darkened now, and thousands of lights glittered across a skyline unlike anything I had ever seen on Earth. Towers of glass and stone stretching toward the stars, alien ships gliding silently between them, like fireflies drifting through the night. The Queen stood at the edge of the balcony, her robes shifting gently in the warm evening breeze, and for a long moment she said nothing at all, simply staring out over her city. Do you know how long I have ruled this empire, human? She finally asked, without turning to look at me. I do not, Your Majesty, I admitted. Longer than your entire species has existed, she said quietly. I have watched empires rise and fall. I have watched species conquer their neighbors, only to be conquered themselves centuries later. I have watched countless worlds kneel before me, some out of wisdom, some out of fear, and a few, very few, out of genuine respect, earned through diplomacy rather than conquest. She finally turned to face me, her glowing eyes catching the light of the city below. In 300 cycles, no creature has ever refused to kneel and survive the encounter, she said. Yet you stood there, unarmed against an empire that has erased entire civilizations, and you did not so much as flinch. I flinched plenty on the inside, Your Majesty, I admitted. I simply did not let it show. A faint sound escaped her, something that might have been the alien equivalent of quiet laughter, though it was difficult to tell for certain. Tell me about your people, she said. Not the version prepared by your diplomats. Tell me what you believe to be true. I hesitated for a moment, unsure exactly where to begin, before finally deciding to simply speak honestly, the way I had spoken since the very first moment I refused to kneel. My people have fought countless wars against each other, I said. We have made terrible mistakes throughout our history, mistakes I am not proud of, mistakes that still haunt parts of our world today. But if there is one thing that remains true across every chapter of our history, it is this. We have never, not once, permanently accepted being ruled by force. Every empire that ever tried to control us through fear alone eventually crumbled, sometimes after generations, but it always crumbled eventually, because somewhere among us, someone always refused to kneel. The Queen listened closely, her expression unreadable, though I noticed her posture had shifted slightly, leaning ever so slightly toward me as I spoke. And what happens to those who defy such empires in the meantime? She asked, before your history eventually corrects itself. Many of them do not survive, I admitted quietly, but their refusal is remembered long after they are gone, and that memory becomes the reason the next generation refuses as well. She was silent for a long moment, staring out over the glittering city, before she finally spoke again, her voice softer than before. I have advisors who believe your species should be catalogued alongside every other world that has come before you, she said. Assigned tribute, assigned resource obligations, absorbed slowly into the greater structure of this empire, the same as everyone else. I felt my chest tighten at her words, though I kept my expression carefully neutral. "And what do you believe, Your Majesty?" I asked. She turned to look at me fully then, her glowing eyes studying my face with an intensity that made it difficult to hold her gaze, though I forced myself to do so anyway. "I believe," she said slowly, "that a species capable of producing someone like you, someone willing to stand alone against an entire empire without hesitation, is not a species that will ever remain quietly conquered, no matter how carefully we structure the terms." I said nothing, unsure exactly how to respond to that, and she continued. "Which means," she said, "that the only sustainable path forward is not conquest at all. It is something far rarer in the history of this empire." I felt my pulse quicken, though I forced myself to remain still, waiting for her to finish the thought. She studied me a moment longer before finally speaking the words that would change everything that came after. "I am considering an alliance," she said quietly. "Not a conquest. Not a subjugation, an alliance, between equals, the first this empire has ever offered to any species in recorded history." The weight of her words settled over me slowly, and for the first time since we had arrived on this world, I allowed myself a small, cautious breath of something that almost resembled hope. "But an alliance such as this cannot be decided lightly," she continued, her tone growing more serious. "My advisors will resist. Many of them still believe your species should be treated exactly as every other world before you. If I bring this proposal before the full council, you will need to convince far more than just me, human." "I understand," I said quietly. "Then rest tonight," she said, turning back toward the city lights. "Tomorrow, you will stand before my council, and you will need every ounce of the same conviction that kept you standing in my throne room today." I nodded slowly, and as she turned to leave the balcony, I found myself staring out over that alien city, thinking of Earth, of my father's voice, of every soldier whose name was etched onto that memorial wall back home, and I understood, with a certainty that settled deep into my bones, that whatever happened tomorrow would decide far more than just my own fate. It would decide the fate of everyone I had ever sworn to protect. I barely slept that night. The chambers they gave me were comfortable enough, carved from the same glowing stone as the rest of the palace, with a wide window overlooking the alien city below, but my mind refused to settle. I kept replaying every moment since we had first stepped off our ship, every decision that had led me to this point, wondering whether I had made the right choice or simply delayed the inevitable. Claire found me just before dawn, standing at the window, watching the first light of the alien sun begin to color the horizon in shades of deep orange and violet. "You should try to rest," she said quietly, stepping up beside me. "I could not," I admitted. "Too much rests on today." She was silent for a long moment, staring out at the same horizon I had been watching. "Whatever happens in there," she finally said, "you have already done more for humanity in the last 2 days than most diplomats manage in entire careers. I want you to know that, regardless of the outcome." I appreciated her words, though I could not fully accept them. Not yet. Not until I knew whether today would end in an alliance or in disaster. We were escorted to the council chamber shortly after, a vast circular room lined with seats occupied by advisors and representatives from what appeared to be every corner of the Drenmore Dominion. Some of them I recognized from the throne room the day before, including the tall, silver-marked advisor who had announced the ancient law of challenge. Others were entirely unfamiliar, creatures from worlds I could not begin to guess at, their expressions ranging from curious to openly hostile. Queen Ysandra sat at the head of the chamber, her expression calm and composed, though I noticed a subtle tension in the way her advisors positioned themselves around her, as though the very structure of the room had been arranged to remind everyone present exactly where the true power resided. The silver-marked advisor rose first, his voice carrying easily through the chamber. "Your Majesty," he began, addressing the Queen directly rather than acknowledging me at all. This proposal defies every precedent this council has established across 300 cycles. We do not form alliances with unconquered species. We absorb them, we structure them, and in time, they come to understand the benefits of our protection. This has always been our path, and it has never once failed us. Several other advisors murmured in agreement, and I felt the weight of their collective skepticism pressing down on me before I had even spoken a single word. The Queen's gaze shifted toward me, and I understood immediately that this was my moment to speak, whether I felt ready for it or not. I stepped forward into the center of the chamber, feeling dozens of alien eyes settle on me at once, and I forced myself to remember exactly why I had refused to kneel in the first place. I understand this council has never encountered a species like mine before, I began, my voice steady despite the nervous energy coiling in my chest. But I would ask you to consider why that might be. Every world you have absorbed into this empire eventually accepted its place within your structure, because eventually, resistance became more costly than compliance. My people are not opposed to peace. We are opposed to peace that requires surrendering the right to determine our own future. The silver-marked advisor rose again, his tone sharp with barely restrained impatience. Every species believes itself unique in this regard, human, he said, and every species eventually learns otherwise. Perhaps, I said, meeting his gaze directly, or perhaps you have simply never encountered a species whose history is defined almost entirely by refusing to accept limits placed upon it by outside forces. We have divided our own world more times than I can count. We have fought wars against ourselves that make your ancient conquests look almost gentle by comparison. And yet somehow, across all of that chaos, we have always found our way back toward unity, not because someone forced it upon us, but because we chose it ourselves. Another advisor, a shorter creature with deep blue scales along her arms, leaned forward with obvious skepticism. And why should this council believe that choice extends to accepting alliance with an empire your species only just discovered exists? She asked. Because an alliance built on mutual respect tends to last far longer than one built on fear, I said. History has taught my people that lesson many times over. Empires built purely on domination eventually collapse, because domination requires constant maintenance, constant vigilance against rebellion. But alliances built on genuine partnership tend to strengthen over time, because both sides have a reason to protect what they have built together. The chamber fell into a tense silence, and I could see several advisors exchanging uncertain glances, clearly unprepared for an argument framed in terms of long-term stability rather than simple defiance. The Queen finally spoke, her voice cutting cleanly through the tension. This council has spent 300 cycles perfecting a system of absorption that has never once failed to secure lasting order, she said. Yet lasting order is not the same as lasting strength. I have watched entire regions of this empire grow complacent under total control, contributing little beyond what is required of them, innovating nothing, contributing nothing beyond mere survival. If this human's claims about his species prove accurate, an alliance with Earth may offer something this empire has not encountered in a very long time. What benefit could possibly outweigh the risk of leaving an entire species unconquered? The silver-marked advisor asked, his tone edging toward genuine alarm. The benefit of genuine innovation, the Queen said simply. Genuine ambition. A species that refuses to remain conquered is also a species that refuses to remain stagnant. I have reviewed the reports gathered from our brief skirmishes with Earth's forces before this delegation arrived. Their technology, while less advanced than our own in many respects, has developed at a pace unmatched by any civilization in our historical records. Given true partnership rather than forced compliance, I believe this species could contribute far more to this empire's future than any conquered world ever has. The chamber erupted into overlapping voices, some advisors clearly supportive, others visibly resistant, the debate growing louder and more chaotic with every passing moment. I stood quietly in the center of it all, watching the argument unfold, understanding that the outcome of this council meeting rested on factors far beyond my control now. Finally, the Queen raised a single hand, and the chamber fell silent almost instantly, generations of conditioning responding automatically to the gesture. "I have made my decision," she said, her voice calm but final. "This council was established to advise me, not to overrule me. Earth will be offered formal alliance under terms of mutual respect and shared sovereignty, the first such offer this empire has extended in its recorded history." Several advisors looked visibly uncomfortable, though none dared to voice further objection after such a clear declaration. The silver-marked advisor lowered his head slightly, a gesture that seemed to convey reluctant acceptance rather than genuine agreement. The Queen turned her attention back to me, her glowing eyes steady and unreadable as always. "You understand, human, that this alliance will require significant negotiation before it becomes formal," she said. "Terms of trade, terms of mutual defense, terms of technological exchange. This is only the beginning of a much longer conversation." "I understand, Your Majesty," I said, "and I am grateful for the opportunity to begin that conversation as equals, rather than as conquered subjects." She studied me a moment longer, and for the first time since we had arrived on this world, I thought I saw something almost like approval flicker behind those glowing eyes. "Return to your delegation," she said. "Prepare your formal proposals. We will reconvene in 3 days to begin the true work of building this alliance." I bowed my head slightly, a genuine gesture of respect rather than submission, and turned to leave the chamber, feeling the weight of dozens of alien eyes following me the entire way. Claire and Oliver were waiting just outside the chamber doors, and the moment I stepped through, Claire rushed forward, gripping my arm tightly. "Well?" she asked, her voice tight with anticipation. I allowed myself a small, exhausted smile, the first genuine smile I had managed since we first arrived on this world. "We are not conquered," I said quietly. "We are equals." Claire's eyes widened, and for a moment, she simply stared at me, as though she needed several seconds to fully process what those words actually meant. Then, slowly, a smile spread across her own face, matching mine. Oliver let out a breath he had clearly been holding for what felt like hours, running a hand through his hair. "I genuinely thought we were all going to die in that arena yesterday," he admitted. "So did I said honestly. "But sometimes the only way forward is to refuse to accept the alternative." We walked back through the palace corridors together, past alien guards who watched us with expressions I could not quite read, past murals depicting conquests I hoped Earth would never become a part of, and for the first time since stepping onto this world, I allowed myself to believe that we might actually succeed at something far larger than mere survival. We might actually succeed at changing the very nature of how this empire chose to expand across the stars, one refusal to kneel at a time. The 3 days that followed passed in a blur of preparation, and I quickly learned that surviving an arena fight had been the easier part of this entire mission. Claire worked through the nights drafting proposals, reviewing every scrap of intelligence we had gathered about Drenmore trade practices, defense structures, and diplomatic customs, while Oliver coordinated constant updates back to Earth through our ship's long-range communication array, keeping our government informed of every development as it unfolded. I spent much of that time in quiet conversation with Queen Ysandra, walks through her gardens, discussions on private balconies overlooking the glittering city, each conversation peeling back another layer of the empire she had spent centuries building. I learned that she had inherited this throne from a lineage that stretched back further than any human record could measure, and that her early reign had been defined by conquest, the same as every ruler before her, until something had shifted within her over the passing centuries, a growing awareness that total domination created empires that were vast but ultimately fragile. "You remind me of myself," she admitted during one of these conversations, standing beside me on a balcony overlooking a garden filled with plants unlike anything Earth had ever produced, tall stalks glowing faintly blue in the evening light. "I doubt that, Your Majesty," I said carefully. "I have led no empires. I have conquered no worlds. Perhaps not, she said. But when I was young, centuries before you were even born, I too refused to kneel before someone who demanded it of me. My predecessor believed total control required absolute obedience from everyone beneath him, including his own family. I refused, and it very nearly cost me my life. I had not expected such a personal admission, and I found myself studying her more closely, searching for some hint of the young ruler she must have once been, centuries before becoming the calm, composed figure who now stood beside me. "What happened?" I asked quietly. "I survived," she said simply. "And in surviving, I understood something my predecessor never did. Fear creates obedience, but it never creates loyalty. Loyalty must be earned, patiently, over time, through actions rather than threats." It took me centuries to fully apply that lesson to how I govern this empire. Perhaps your species will not need centuries to understand what took me so long to learn. I considered her words carefully before responding. "My people are still learning that lesson ourselves," I admitted. "We have made many mistakes throughout our history, mistakes born from exactly the kind of fear-based control you are describing. But I believe, given enough time, we tend to find our way back towards something better." She studied me for a long moment, her glowing eyes catching the soft blue light of the garden below. "That is precisely why I believe this alliance is worth the risk my council fears so greatly," she said. On the morning of the third day, we gathered once more in the council chamber, this time joined by additional representatives from several allied worlds within the Drenmore Dominion, creatures who had traveled considerable distances to witness what promised to be a historic moment. The chamber buzzed with quiet conversation as Claire and I prepared our final proposal, reviewing our notes one last time before the formal proceedings began. Just before the session started, one of the Queen's guards approached me quietly, his expression tense. "The human," he said quietly, careful not to draw attention from the gathering crowd. "There is something you should know before the council convenes." I straightened immediately, sensing the seriousness in his tone. "What is it?" I asked. "Advisor Threnok," he said, referring to the silver-marked advisor who had opposed the alliance from the very beginning, "has been meeting privately with representatives from 3 border worlds over the past 2 nights. Worlds that profit heavily from the current system of tribute and absorption. I believe they intend to disrupt today's proceedings." My pulse quickened, though I forced myself to remain outwardly calm. "Disrupt how?" I asked. "I do not know the specifics," he admitted. "Only that something is being planned. I felt you deserved to know, given everything you risked in that arena." I thanked him quietly and quickly relayed the information to Claire, whose expression tightened with concern. "We cannot prove any of this," she said. "If we accuse Threnok without evidence, we risk looking desperate or worse, dishonest." "Then we simply stay alert," I said, "and we make certain our proposal is strong enough to withstand whatever they attempt." The council session began shortly after, and for the first hour, everything proceeded smoothly. Claire presented our formal proposal with confidence and precision, outlining terms of trade that would benefit both civilizations, technological exchange programs that respected the sovereignty of both worlds, and mutual defense agreements that positioned Earth as a genuine partner rather than a subordinate territory. Several advisors who had initially seemed skeptical appeared to warm slightly to the terms as she spoke, nodding along at key points. Then Advisor Threnok rose from his seat, and I felt the guard's earlier warning settle heavily in my chest. "Before this council commits to such an unprecedented arrangement," he said, his voice carrying easily through the chamber, "I believe it is only fair that we test the true depth of Earth's commitment to this alliance, rather than simply accepting words offered by diplomats eager to avoid conquest." The Queen's eyes narrowed slightly, though her expression remained otherwise composed. "What are you proposing, Threnok?" she asked, her tone carrying a note of warning. "A demonstration of resource capability," he said smoothly. "If Earth truly wishes to be treated as an equal partner within this empire, they should be willing to share full details of their planetary defense systems immediately, rather than negotiating such details gradually over time as their proposal suggests." I understood immediately what he was attempting. Full disclosure of Earth's defense capabilities, offered before any formal alliance had even been signed, would leave our homeworld dangerously exposed should these negotiations somehow collapse. It was a demand designed specifically to either force us into a vulnerable position or to make our inevitable refusal look like evidence of bad faith. Claire opened her mouth to respond, but I stepped forward first, my voice steady, despite the tension coiling tightly in my chest. Advisor Threnok raises an interesting point about trust, I said, choosing my words carefully. But true partnership is built gradually, through demonstrated good faith on both sides, not through one party surrendering their security before any formal agreement exists. I would ask the Council to consider this. Would the Drenmore Dominion be willing to share full details of its own core defense grid with an unproven ally before any formal treaty had been signed and ratified? Several advisors shifted uncomfortably at the question, and I saw a flicker of something like satisfaction cross the Queen's expression, though she said nothing yet, clearly allowing the moment to play out. Threnok's composure slipped slightly. "That is an entirely different situation," he said. "This empire's stability is already proven across centuries. Earth's stability remains entirely unproven." "Then perhaps," I said, "the appropriate demonstration of good faith is not the immediate surrender of sensitive defense information, but rather a structured timeline of gradual trust building, exactly as our original proposal outlines, beginning with limited technological exchange, expanding over time as both sides demonstrate consistent honesty and cooperation." The chamber fell into a tense silence, and I watched several advisors who had appeared aligned with Threnok begin exchanging uncertain glances, clearly recognizing the fairness of my counterproposal, even if it disrupted whatever plan they had originally intended. The Queen finally spoke, her voice cutting cleanly through the silence. "The humans' counterproposal is reasonable," she said. "Gradual trust building has served this empire well in every successful alliance we have maintained with allied border worlds. I see no reason to abandon that precedent now, simply because our newest potential ally happens to come from beyond our previously known borders." Threnok clearly recognized that his maneuver had failed, and after a long moment of visible frustration, he lowered himself back into his seat without further protest, though his expression remained tight with obvious displeasure. The remainder of the council session proceeded far more smoothly, and by the time the sun had begun to set outside the chamber's high windows, casting long shadows of deep orange and violet across the polished floor, the formal terms of alliance between Earth and the Drenmore Dominion had been agreed upon, pending final ratification from both governing bodies. Queen Ysandra rose from her throne as the session concluded, her glowing eyes settling on me one final time before the chamber began to empty. "Walk with me, human," she said quietly. We stepped out onto the same balcony where we had spoken so many times over the previous days, the city below glittering brightly beneath the darkening sky, alien ships drifting silently between towers of glass and stone. "You have accomplished something remarkable," she said, staring out over her city. "In 3 days, you have changed the trajectory of relations between an ancient empire and a species barely beginning its journey among the stars." "I did not accomplish this alone," I said honestly. "Claire's diplomacy, Oliver's diligence, and your own willingness to consider something beyond centuries of precedent, all of it mattered just as much as anything I did." "Perhaps," she said, "but it began with you, refusing to kneel in a hall where kneeling had always been the only acceptable response. That single choice created the possibility for everything that followed." I considered her words for a long moment before responding. "Where I come from, Your Majesty, we have a saying," I said. "Sometimes the smallest act of defiance changes the course of history far more than any grand strategy ever could." She turned to look at me fully then, and for the first time since we had first met in that glowing throne room, I saw something that unmistakably resembled respect in her ancient, unreadable eyes. "Then let us hope, human," she said quietly, "that this particular act of defiance marks the beginning of something worth remembering for centuries to come." I looked out over that alien city one final time, thinking of Earth, of my father's steady voice, of every soldier whose name had been etched onto that memorial wall back home, and I understood, with a certainty that settled deep into my bones, that we had not simply survived this encounter. We had changed it entirely. Somewhere far above us, beyond the darkening sky and the glittering lights of an ancient alien city, our small ship waited patiently to carry us home, carrying with it news that would forever alter humanity's place among the stars. Not as subjects, not as conquered territory to be absorbed and forgotten, as equals, standing tall among civilizations far older than our own, exactly the way my father always insisted we were capable of standing, if only we found the courage never to kneel.